whole point was scaring, sort of abusing the audience. Jaws, scaring, frightening us. This thing is sort of, what's mysterious is unknown, and we love it, rather than running from that shark or running from the devil.
There's a reason that Close Encounters of the Third Kind continues to feel extraterrestrial almost half a century later. But what if we were to tell you that the actual backstory of the film is even weirder than what happened on screen? From the unconventional experiences of the cast to production choices that even Hollywood insiders couldn't fathom, what went down off camera is never talked about, and even less frequently explained. Why does this movie just feel so different from any other Alien film? What really happened in the making of it? Stay tuned, because shedding the layers of mystery surrounding this film is a story that went against every expectation and almost didn't get to the screen at all. Close Encounters of the Third Kind started not with special effects or cameras, but with Steven Spielberg, a new director still basking in the glow of his Jaws success. Despite the fact that he had already shown that he was capable of producing a box office phenomenon, his next concept encountered outright hostility. Spielberg had a vision of a science fiction film unlike anything Hollywood had ever produced. Instead of portraying aliens as invasive, hostile creatures, he envisioned them as glowing, benign, and mysterious, wonder symbols rather than symbols of doom. Within the cultural atmosphere of the 1970s, where Cold War fears, paranoia, and a cinematic intake of monster rampages and space wars filled the screens, Spielberg's sales pitch was dismissed as naive best, suicidal worst. Studios rejected it repeatedly. Executives couldn't envision people sitting through a movie without the old thrills, cities burning, armies clashing, humanity on the brink of extinction. Spielberg wasn't peddling War of the Worlds or Invasion of the Body Snatchers. He was peddling something more like Kubrick's 2001, but with emotional appeal and everyday, people-like characters. He wasn't peddling spectacle, he was peddling transcendence. Columbia Pictures finally agreed to finance the project, but only hesitantly. The studio was in financial trouble and, honestly, desperate for success. They weren't convinced by the film itself as much as by Spielberg's reputation following Jaws. If he could make a shark into a cultural phenomenon, perhaps he could do the same with aliens. But studio heads pushed against Spielberg's vision from the start, insisting on rewrites that made the story more conventional. Richard Dreyfuss, who played Roy Neary, remembered executives repeatedly asking him for explosions, fights, and bad guys. They wanted conflict. Spielberg would only push for connection. He rewrote the script several times, removing invasion details, violent battles, and conventions, and substituting awe, music, light, and spiritual longing. Terry Garr, playing Roy's increasingly distant wife Ronnie, recalled that the studio couldn't understand how a film with no lasers or overlords could possibly be worth the spiraling budget. Melinda Dillon, playing Gillian, the mother looking for her missing son, recalled the tension on set whenever money came up. Spielberg's film was costly, risky, and at the very least foreign to Hollywood thinking. But he wouldn't back down. For him, Close Encounters wasn't entertainment. It was a notion of what it is to stretch beyond ourselves, to conceptualize the unknown as lovely and not as frightening. Spielberg's most daring and defining decision was his choice of Devil's Tower in Wyoming as the destination. In theory, it was an unusual one, an odd volcanic protrusion in the center of an open plain. But Spielberg wasn't necessarily interested in geography alone. Devil's Tower had deep spiritual meaning to Native American tribes such as the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Kiowa, who regarded it as holy ground, a place of myth and divine intervention. By locating the climactic encounter between humans and extraterrestrial visitors there, Spielberg interpolated an ancient cultural symbol of oneness with the universe into his own story. For Richard Dreyfuss, being under the tower was a life-changing experience. He said, "It was like having the Earth become part of the narrative, an old monument adding seriousness and authenticity to the story." Melinda Dillon said shooting there was more like a pilgrimage and less like on a movie set. It was like being in a cathedral constructed not by human beings, but by the planet itself to her. The whole cast and crew sensed the location affecting their work. It wasn't a background, but a character informing the way they spoke, moved, and envisioned their characters. François Truffaut, the great French director Spielberg, hired to play scientist Claude Lacombe, referred to Devil's Tower as the ideal union of science and myth, a site where intellect and wonder could exist. And there was the mothership. To this day, the radiantly descending figure of that shining craft is one of the most stunning shots in science fiction film history. In fact, however, it was a 4-foot model illuminated with thousands of small bulbs hand-synchronized to flash and glimmer in dazzling sequences. Spielberg and his crew would not use post-production effects alone. Rather, they developed a live light and sound effect on location, so the actors could respond spontaneously. Richard Dreyfuss recalled being amazed, even by the miniature. It was alive, smart, responsive, almost. Terry Gard described performing with the ship's screen of lights and music as entering a living machine. Their wonder wasn't ersatz, it was real, and it is reflected in their performances. The vessel itself was built not to awe but to entice. Its smooth curves, golden light, and cathedral-like majesty represented Spielberg's vision of alien encounter as communion, not conquest. François Truffaut likened its arrival to a visitation from the divine. Richard Dreyfuss reduced it to basics. The ship didn't. That invitation lay at the center of the film's emotional core, realized most powerfully in Dreyfuss's own acting. To portray Roy Neary, the common man driven mad by fixation after seeing a UFO, Dreyfuss took things to an extreme. He cut himself off from friends and relatives, interrogated alleged alien encounter witnesses, and delved deep into research on trauma and obsessive-compulsive disorder. He wanted to demonstrate what it's like when a mind starts coming apart at the seams when confronted with the unthinkable. His ad-libbing of the mashed potato scene, where Roy carves Devil's Tower at the dinner table, was drawn straight from his research. It wasn't scripted, but Spielberg knew that it was authentic the moment he saw it. Dreyfuss wasn't acting, he was bringing obsession, loss, and epiphany to life before their eyes. Terry Gar conceded that his intensity frightened her so often, sometimes it was hard to distinguish where Roy left off and Richard started. This obscuring of the line between performance and collapse gave the film a gritty, disturbing realism. If Dreyfuss was the emotional center, Truffaut was the intellectual anchor. Hiring the French auteur was a bold stroke. Truffaut was not an actor. He was a director, a critic, one of the most powerful voices in European filmmaking. Spielberg hired him not for Hollywood sheen, but for truth. As Truffaut's Lacombe, curiosity, humility, and composure emanated from him. He was not acting a scientist, as much as he was becoming one in spirit, looking and listening rather than panicking or posing. With his presence, the tone of the film shifted to one of humanism. Where others panicked, Lacombe reacted with interest, an option that supported Spielberg's main theme: the unknown must not be feared but known. On location, Spielberg would sometimes perform whole scenes for Truffaut to replicate, but what came out wasn't imitation. It was something quieter, more profound. Richard Dreyfuss once testified, Truffaut didn't act. He existed. That existence helped give the movie its equilibrium, balancing chaos with tranquility, obsession with observation, fear with hope. And then the music, the 5 haunting notes that would become one of the most recognizable motifs in the history of cinema. Composer John Williams did not compose them as a memorable theme. He created them as a believable mode of communication. He researched mathematical interrelationships within tone, seeking a progression that might feel universal rather than culturally bound. The product was 5 notes that conveyed curiosity, intelligence, and tranquility rather than conflict. On location, Spielberg made the iconic musical exchange be played live, with lights and sound coordinated in real time. François Truffaut also described it as if he was part of an actual conversation. Music was the bridge of worlds, evidence that harmony can exist beyond language. For Roy Neary, those 5 notes weren't simply noise, they were a summons beckoning him towards his fate. To audiences, they became indelible, a representation of our shared desire to connect with something bigger. And even more remarkably, scientists later debated Williams's theme as a demonstration of how mankind might actually try to make first contact, demonstrating just how much Spielberg and his team took the concept seriously. But for all its magic, Close Encounters also had a darker subtext, its chillingly realistic portrayal of government secrecy. Spielberg consulted with military advisors and UFO researchers in order to create the film's presentation of misinformation, disinformation, and cover-ups. What resulted was a representation of secrecy that hit uncomfortably close to home. The 1970s were an era of profound public skepticism, marred by Watergate and exposes of institutionalized corruption. The notion that the government would conceal alien contact seemed less fantasy and more fate. Richard Dreyfuss has since said that audiences were predisposed to take it for granted because they already presumed to be lied to about everything else. Some officials also privately fretted about the film's impact. Spielberg had blurred the distinction between entertainment and suggestion, titillating cultural paranoia, but also mirroring it back. What if aliens weren't the issue? What if humanity itself, the deception, the fear, the control, was the hindrance? That tension made the movie work on several levels. It wasn't merely about light and music and spaceships. It was about belief, trust, and what occurs when ordinary human beings are pulled into mysteries governments wish to cover up. Spielberg noted human failing, our fear, our control, our desire to conceal what we don't comprehend. But he would not permit cynicism to prevail. Close Encounters of the Third Kind ended not with destruction or war, but with an individual walking forward, forsaking fear, family, and familiarity to greet the unknown. Roy Neary's going aboard the mother ship was an extreme gesture of faith, a cinematic experience of transcendence that made alien contact more akin to spiritual awakening. Close Encounters of the Third Kind was not about aliens. It was about yearning, connection, and the thin line between insanity and epiphany. It was created under relentless pressure, rewritten over studio opposition, performed under the magic of sacred terrain, and constructed on models and melodies that became ageless. Its performers delivered more than performances. They delivered themselves, sometimes to the point of emotional exposure. Its director held out for meaning when the industry needed explosions. Its music turned into words. Its conspiracy became prophecy, and almost